Okay. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to StatTech Research's seminar on measuring progress and well-being. So I am Kelsey O'Connor. I'm one of the organizers, and we also have Chiara Peroni and Francesco Saracino online. Today, we are pleased to have Amanda Janoo speak about policies for a well-being economy. But before introducing her, I have a few items to mention. First off, our conference, Wellbeing 2022, starts a week from today. We're very excited to welcome 90 speakers from around the world here in Luxembourg. For those of you who cannot make it, unfortunately like Amanda, we will record the keynotes and policy roundtable, and we're going to make them available online on our YouTube channel. So please look for an email following the event, and we'll provide links to those. Back to today's seminar, I'd like to remind you that we are recording the event, and to please keep your microphones muted during the presentation. Amanda will speak for approximately 40 minutes and then address questions at the end, at which time please raise your virtual hands or post your questions in the chat. For the sake of the recording, what we'll do is we need to read them aloud to get verbally. So either I can read them or you can read them out to yourself. Now to introduce Amanda Janoo. So Amanda Janoo is the Economics and Policy Lead for the Wellbeing Economy Alliance. She's an economic policy expert with over a decade of experience working with governments and international development institutions around the world. Her work aims to build just and sustainable economies through well-being-oriented and participatory policy design processes. Prior to joining the Wellbeing Economy Alliance, Amanda worked for the United Nations and African Development Bank as an industrial policy and structural transformation expert. As a Fulbright researcher, she explored the relationship between international trade and informal employment. She graduated from Cambridge University with an MPhil in Development Studies and hails from the Green Mountain state of Vermont in the United States. And if you're unfamiliar with the Wellbeing Economy Alliance more broadly, it is the leading collaboration of change makers working together to transform the economic system towards a system that puts the well-being of the economy and the planet first. Personally, I'm very much looking forward to Amanda's talk. So without further ado, we are pleased to welcome you, Amanda Janoo. The floor is yours.
Well, thank you so much, Kelsey, and I'm really excited to be here as well. I had a wonderful conversation with Francesco, and I'm starting to get a bit of an understanding of some of the really innovative and visionary research and policy initiatives that are happening in Luxembourg, and so feels very synchronistic to have this opportunity to also share a bit about the thinking and initiatives that have been happening within the Wellbeing Economy Alliance to better understand how this transformation can really occur in practice, right? And so recognizing when we think about how to design policies for a different economic system, that this is all still emergent. And so we get little pieces here and there from different communities and governments around the world that can give us insights on sort of next steps, but also really grounded in identifying where those gaps are and where I hope Luxembourg and maybe other, thinkers, researchers, organizations here can support in that innovation as well. And so in order to start with any sort of discussion about the well-being economy, it's always good to sort of start with a foundation on what do we even mean by that? What is the well-being economy movement? And then what does that mean in terms of the approaches that we take for designing policies for that type of transformation? And so the first question, is really what is the economy? And so when I Googled the term economy, this is the first image that came up. And I think that this is probably a very common kind of image that we associate when we think about the economy as, stock market values, GDP growth rates, jagged lines, and all of that can often make the economy feel like something that's pretty abstract that happens out there, that happens to us and is beyond our control. But what's important to sort of remember is that ultimately we are the economy. The economy is just the way that we produce and provide for one another. It's an activity, it's a means, it's a way in which we improve our collective quality of life. But one of the challenges has been that somewhere along the way, we got really fixated on the economy and this means as if it were a goal in and of itself. And so I really like this quote by Einstein around the perfection of means and confusion of ends sort of seems to characterize our age. And so really focused a lot of our energy on figuring out how to grow the economy, how to increase the amount of production or consumption, without always keeping an eye on whether or not that was actually translating into improvements in our quality of life the way that we had assumed. And so I had a look at your website, actually, because I know that Luxembourg is now in its third year of assessing sort of holistic well-being. And this recognition that, we have gotten really good at promoting economic growth, but it's not necessarily translating into improvements in well-being. And so what you've identified here, that well-being in Luxembourg not following the same trajectory as economic growth, is actually very similar to what we're seeing globally as well. So we're seeing almost exponential levels of GDP growth, but our well-being, our quality of life is no longer improving along with that, and in many ways actually leaving us worse off. And so obviously one of the major issues right now, especially post-pandemic, but even for decades prior, is just the extreme levels of inequality. So we've built an economic system which is systematically concentrating wealth into the hands of fewer and fewer individuals and corporations. And so the recent Oxfam report that just came out found that 10 individuals doubled their wealth since the pandemic, whereas 99% of humanity has been left worse off, right? And so that is not only economically unsustainable, but very ethically problematic for our societies. We also, as well, I think, are increasingly very clear that we are in an extreme environmental crisis where our systems of production and consumption are actively destroying our planet and threatening our very survival. And then when you add on top of all of that, just the increasing level of anxiety and depression that is spreading worldwide, with now depression being the leading cause of disability, according to the WHO, you kind of have to start questioning what's it all for? Yeah, if in the end it's not making us happy and it's ultimately leading to some really, really challenging existential threats for our species. But the thing is that all of this is not getting lost on people, and people are really calling for economic change. And so according to surveys, over half of the globe now believes that our current economic system is doing more harm than good. And that very much connected to this, they're losing trust in particularly government institutions because they believe that democracy is being eroded and that governments are really only working in service of the interests of the elite and a select few. And that on the other side of this also, we are seeing, particularly within G20 countries, the supposed winners, of this system, the rich nations, that 74% of people really want their national economic priorities to move beyond this narrow fixation on profit and wealth to really focus more on human well-being and ecological protection. And so that's really the foundation of the well-being economy movement. And so it comes under a lot of different banners. So whether you want to call it donut economics or solidarity economy, circular economy, community wealth building, buen vivir, or many other names, at their heart is it's about this recognition that we need to stop treating people and planet like they're here to serve the economy and start treating the economy like it's here to serve us. And so that has really been sort of the foundations of the well-being economy movement, and this recognition that we need to sort of break out of this cycle of just growing the economy as our number one priority so that we can take some of that wealth through taxes to try to fix the damages that are done to people and planet in the process, right? And so how do we really move upstream and get the economy to do more of the heavy lifting in the sense of already achieving the kind of societal goals that we're aiming for before the state has to come in and sort of fix and problem solve and firefight after the fact. And so for us at the Wellbeing Economy Alliance, we have this vision, right, of a different economic system, which is not just about perpetuating itself or about generating wealth, but really focused on generating well-being for our people and planet, and which is really designed and evaluated by its capacity to meet our fundamental needs for dignity, right? So how do we evaluate our economies in terms of its capacity to ensure that everybody has the necessary foundations to live a life of comfort and safety and happiness? how can we evaluate our economy in terms of its capacity to actually respect and cherish our natural environment, to restore it, regenerate it, and ensure that it is protected for generations to come. And how do we really think about building an economy which is founded in fairness, right? That recognizes our need for fairness in the sense of giving back as much as we take, right? And so that in and of itself is a pretty radical economic idea within the current paradigm, but we are in need of balance, right? And we are in need of a radical reduction in inequalities in terms of not only income, but power and time and voice. And then also critically, we want to think about an economy that really is designed with a different purpose, where we are evaluating and assigning value to our economic activities and behaviors according to their contribution to our well-being, so that we can really foster a sense of meaning and purpose, but also of belonging and connection. Because so much of that really at the heart of our economy, it's a way in which we connect with one another, right? It's a way we provide for one another, and that has so much fundamental importance to us as individuals and the quality of life we have. And then last, but certainly not least, is really this need for participation, because I think one of the most challenging things about contemporary globalization has been that so many people feel they don't have a voice over their livelihoods and over our collective destiny. And so how can we make this space for greater self-determination so that people can be active agents in molding and directing the economy aligned with their values and objectives? And so all of that, I'm sure, sounds fantastic, right? Sign me up. Let's have a well-being economy. But the question, of course, is how do we actually get there? Yeah. So a vision and a hopeful alternative by which to work, I think, is already very powerful. But when we were thinking about practically how do we move towards that system, this is where the motivation for developing this policy design guide came from. And because participation is such an important principle for this, when we were developing the guide, I really wanted to engage as much of the membership as possible also in the co-creation of this resource, so that it was developed in a participatory way with participation at its whole. And so throughout the guide, you'll find quotes from different members who engaged and participated in this project. And one of them is Till, who is from the Club of Rome. And I think he outlined pretty beautifully the motivation for this guide when he said, the flaws in mainstream economics and GDP are now really well documented. But what we actually need is a practical guide on how do you build a well-being economy and organize this transition in a democratic and participatory way. Because that kind of guide can actually help to institutionalize this process, give tools to policymakers, and ultimately, critically, make building a well-being economy feel like a reality, right? Like that it's a feasible alternative. And so with this ambition in mind, the first thing we did was really thinking about what are those principles that would need to underpin a policy design process for a well-being economy. And so I won't speak about all of them, but there's a few that I would like to emphasize here, right? And so first of all, I think probably the goal orientation one is the clearest, right? So if we need to switch our goal from economic growth to really social and ecological well-being, and then think about how we can evaluate and design our economy in service of that. But the contextual one is really important as well for this guide, because particularly working in international development, one of the things you realize is that when you're studying economics, the way that I did, one of the fundamentalist assumptions is that economies function the same across all space and time. But if you think of the economy as the way we provide for one another, then you obviously realize that culture and history and politics and geography and so many different factors influence that system of the ways in which we produce things and provide things to one another. And so allowing space for this guide to provide useful tools that could be then adapted to context, right? And so it's not a one-size-fits-all silver bullet sort of approach, but really allowing for that space and humility for experimentation and adaptation. The other one I wanted to mention is the strength-based approach, because that's actually maybe the most challenging one, because governments traditionally very much take a problems-based approach, right? So they're there to intervene when there's a major crisis or a challenge or an issue within society, and then to, figure out solutions accordingly. But if we are to take a vision approach, right, to really think about what are the objectives we have as a society, and then to look at what are the existing examples, strengths, and initiatives that are already here that we can build upon, then that takes a very different approach. So an example of this being, right, when working in economic policy, so often it's, okay, we're lacking skills or tech or finance for our economic development. And so therefore we must look to the outside world in order to gain those things, right? As opposed to saying, okay, if we are really looking for, poverty alleviation or more equitable sort of developments, let's look at the existing initiatives, organizations, and businesses that are supporting in that area, and how can we build and replicate and base it off of that. And so then finally, the principle of participation I've mentioned a few times, but I just want to mention it again because you'll notice that that's really probably at the heart of this guide as well, is this idea of engaging as many people in society as possible in this transformative process, because the process of participation not only leads to more innovative and sustainable outcomes, but it's critical for our well-being in and of itself. And so what did that sort of look like in practice? We ended up organizing the guide somewhat around a policy design cycle. So probably, you'll use different terms for this cycle in different countries, but those sort of steps of your agenda setting or visioning, your strategy design, policy assessments, implementation, and then evaluation. And so as a guide, it's written in that sort of linear order, but obviously anybody working in policy knows it doesn't really work that way. It's always all these constant sort of feedback loops. All of these things are interconnected, but it gives you a sense of kind of the structure that I'll go through for this presentation. And so the first one is around developing your well-being vision. And so in Luxembourg, you already have developed, well-being indicators and new systems of measurement. But many communities, are working in this area or are just beginning to try to think about alternative measurements of progress, of success for their community or their country. And so rather than, and this is really important in the guide, this guide is not going to tell you this is what matters for well-being, right? Or these are the indicators you should use, but rather, what are the tools and resources and approaches that can help you to understand what matters for well-being, to craft that alternative vision, and to then ultimately measure it. And so this is the only time I'll show you like a page of the guide, but just to give you a sense of its approach. We recognize, for example, that there's a lot of different ways to go about understanding what matters for well-being, right? So some countries do it based on research of looking at other existing sort of indicators. Some utilize surveys, some utilize community sort of discussions, citizens assemblies, etc. And so within this guide under the how, you find links to resources that can help you to operationalize those different kind of approaches. But then under the WEALL tips, this is where we sort of bring forth our opinions, right, of what we think is best practice within this process. And for us, we really do believe that the best way to understand what matters for well-being is to ask people. Yeah. And that's because we think that the process of people actually deliberating on this question themselves also helps us to move from it just being an abstract idea to something that is internalized within society itself of its own understanding. And so one of the examples I really like is from Germany, where they did a really massive public consultation process across the country of setting up these community discussion forums in every single region of the country, as well as having a huge online and mail-in sort of ballot system for asking their citizens what matters for your well-being. And so they obviously got, thousands and thousands and thousands of responses, but these are some of the ones that came up most often. And I think what's interesting here is that you end up with a mix of outcomes, right? So certain things that are important, like job security or equity, unspoiled nature, but there's also then processes that are identified here, like civic engagement, political participation, as well as values. And so values of helpfulness or solidarity or equity. And this is where, looking at the different examples across countries here, countries are taking very different approaches. Oftentimes they just look at the outcomes because those are the easiest to sort of quantify and focus on. But the values and the processes are where we're seeing some really exciting innovations in terms of integrating those dimensions as well into these processes. And I'll speak more about that in a bit. And so then it's the next point around, you have your sort of understanding of what matters for well-being, but how do you actually craft and communicate this? And we have a policy makers network. And this is actually the question that I think policymakers are most interested in and also struggle with, right? Of how do we utilize communication and information and, media strategies in order to really raise awareness of this different vision. And so this is an image of Buen Vivir, right, from Ecuador, and their well-being vision of a nation and a community that is based in indigenous values of being in harmony with themselves, with one another, and with the natural environment, and to utilize art, right, or music in so many different forms beyond just a document, for example, to really spread these ideas so it resonates and connects with a society. And then comes the point around measurement. And this is definitely where there's the most energy within the well-being economy movement right now, and for obvious good reason, because GDP is not a great, it's a very helpful indicator for certain things, but has been sort of misused as an indicator of our societal progress. And so once again, like, this guide isn't going to say these are the indicators, but we'll give you examples of different ones, and also what are processes for selection of those indicators. And WEALL is personally my favorite well-being framework that exists. And part of that reason is because not only do they have the well-being dimensions and goals, but they also have critically these 5 ways of working, or different principles for how government should be functioning in order to achieve it. And part of that is really about integration and participation and involvement. And so when they were thinking about the selection of indicators, they developed a lot of criteria. And one of them was really around effective communication. So how do we select indicators that are going to be intuitively understood by people, right, to actually reflect that dimension, and where any change can be sort of immediately obvious? Because obviously right now, a lot of the economic indicators we use, most people just have sort of a faith that they matter, yeah, as opposed to a genuine understanding of why or connection to their lives. And so that importance of utilizing data as a foundation for meaningful participation was something that WEALL focused on a lot. And then comes the really tricky, bit, right? And so moving beyond indicators and really then utilizing a well-being vision and framework, or indicators to meaningfully develop a different kind of economic strategy that can be transformative and work in service of well-being. And so this is where I think most governments are stuck. Yeah, so at this point, I would say most governments have some alternative, even if it's just the SDGs, performance indicators. But how do we then align institutions and stakeholders to really take this more holistic approach to strategy design, to then identify the well-being economic activities and behaviors that are going to support this, and to really manage trade-offs, understand trade-offs, and those power dynamics that are going to be a part of this transition as well. And so there's probably many more, I should also say this, processes that are important in the strategy design process, but these are some of the ones we thought we would start with. And so the alignment of institutions across, like breaking down silos, right, and getting all of the various actors involved is really tough, right? You have a certain type of institutional inertia, and also a wisdom for why you have different expert areas. But if we're looking at something as multidimensional and as holistic as well-being, you need to have everybody on board, right? Not only within government, but also the different stakeholders in society. And so one example I really like came from Utah, the state of Utah in the United States. And so they, in the 1990s, their economy was growing really rapidly, and they had fears that this was going to have a negative impact on their environment and quality of life if it wasn't managed in some way. So they wanted to develop a new economic sort of growth strategy that was designed in a really like holistic and also participatory way. And they initially got quite a bit of resistance, yeah, because there were some people who thought, well, this is there's normal people shouldn't be engaged in something as technical as economic planning. And then there were other people who, there were different cities and administrations and agencies who felt like they were encroaching on their space, right? And their autonomy. And so there were a few strategic approaches that they made, which were really important for getting everyone on board. And one was to frame it as a long-term initiative. Yeah, so to not make it a time-bound short project. They also framed it as visioning rather than planning. And this was important because it helped them to move it beyond this idea that it was sort of a technocratic, managerial sort of driven initiative, and that everybody had a space to sort of be engaged, and to also talk about it as a process rather than a project, so that it wasn't associated with any particular administration or cycle, but was viewed as something that was going to be ongoing throughout. And so as a result of this, they were able to get a huge number, all of the various sort of levels of this government engaged, and to do huge amounts of data analysis, community workshops, strategy design approaches. And now, some 30 years later, this is very much the approach that they use to this day for how to sort of manage their economic growth. And then comes, and maybe because I also come from an industrial policy sort of background, I think a really exciting area of where we need more innovation, but also as a fundamental step, is that if we have clarity on our well-being goals or what matters for well-being, how do we then identify the areas of economic life, the economic activities and behaviors that are most essential for that well-being or contributing most? And so from a research perspective, I was talking with Francesco about this, like we're still in need of some of that really deep research, especially for non-monetized areas of the economy, to really understand those correlations. But from an intuitive perspective, COVID was a really great example of how it does not take policymakers very long to at least identify which of the economic activities are most essential for maintaining our survival and our current well-being, right? And it wasn't hedge fund managers, right? And the huge, drivers of our, of profit and wealth in our society, but really those teachers and farmers and grocery clerks and plumbers, et cetera, government, workers who sort of maintain our society. And so this gives us, I think, a starting point for recognizing that this kind of thinking is not so impossible, but we just need more research, innovation, and approaches of governments who are proactively encouraging and rewarding particular economic activities because of their explicit contribution to social or ecological well-being. And then comes, the tricky stuff around managing trade-offs, right, and power dynamics, because ultimately our economy is a system of power. And so I think the just transition initiatives that we're seeing in a lot of communities and countries is a good example of how we're trying to manage different types of trade-offs between, let's say, social and environmental goals. But I think there's also an important innovations to be made in power analysis as well, and thinking about how to, engage stakeholders in a way that meaningfully disperses power, whilst also recognizing some of the implications that will come with this. And then, so the next process is really around policy assessment. And so for us, the question was really around how do we design policies in a way to change the system, right? Because really a lot of our policies are designed intentionally to maintain, right, our system. And so how do we assess and reform existing policies and co-create new ones once we have our strategy and our vision clear around our well-being economy? And so this is another area where so often in policy, we want to start with a new policy, right? We want to create a new one to achieve the particular aim that we have. And so there is a need, yeah, for us to also have more tools that can help us to assess how existing policies are impacting well-being goals, and also how do I say, sort of working as a coherent set, right? And reinforcing one another. And so oftentimes, we in the well-being space, like we think a lot about regulations or incentives or budgets, right? So state provisions, but there are so many different types of policy instruments that we have at our disposal and that we use in different kind of ways. And so figuring out a new process for doing a holistic assessment of policies across those various dimensions to think about how they are impacting our economic system, as well as the ultimate well-being goals, I think would be a really exciting new prospect for innovation, because there is some exciting stuff that's happening within the policy coherence space, but it's still a newer area that maybe you have some ideas on as well. And then the next point here related to that is actually around moving beyond cost benefit analysis, right? And so many of our tools that we have been influenced by a particular type of economic thinking and logic. So it's not just GDP and those high level measurement tools, but it's really those practical tools like cost benefit analysis that transform different factors into financial monetary sort of considerations that then lead us to sort of reproduce certain kinds of logic. And so an exciting area of innovation is, for example, in Iceland with gender mainstreaming and budgeting. So they took the value of equity as the major consideration for then looking at their various existing policies and considering their impacts on different demographic groups, right? So in this case, different genders. And the process of developing that new assessment framework was not easy. It took multiple years. They engaged all of the different ministries to have an understanding of how that could kind of work. And ultimately, they've ended up with really progressive legislation that would otherwise be viewed as financially unviable, but within a values lens was critical, right, to achieve their goals. And so this is another area where innovations around new systems for policy assessments and decision making, I think, we'll see a lot more innovations in the years to come. And then finally, around when we're co-creating new policies, you may be familiar with this example, but the Dedisum Barcelona, so Barcelona's city, after the financial crisis, people were pretty upset, right? They were upset with the government. They were upset with, society at large. And so what they did was they integrated this digital platform, which is free. So the Dedisum platform, so that anybody can directly propose policies, discuss policies, deliberate on them, and vote on them. And the mayor's office promised that if they got a certain amount of support, they would just adopt it. Yeah. And this has been transformative for democracy within this city in terms of really massively increasing citizen participation, trust, and also actually leading Barcelona to have the first climate policy that is really aligned with the Paris Agreement, because it has social justice really at its heart, because they're really practical solutions that are very contextual and place-based, because they came from this kind of participatory approach. And so these are where we're seeing a lot of innovations in terms of utilizing technology or also more traditional forms of deliberative democracy to help with strategy and policy design. And so I know I don't have a ton more time, so I'm going to go through the implementation, these next slides a bit more quickly. But when we're talking about implementation, at least in my experience, you could tell me about in Luxembourg, but this is where everything sort of falls apart. Yeah. So everything seems really great in theory, right? In the strategy document and the policy documents you've developed, but then what happens in reality is not what happened in terms of planning, right? And so implementation is really key here. And so how do we really actually consider new forms of policy implementation that empowers local communities and actors to be the main drivers and agents, so that what is planned is also similar to what is needed and what will happen in reality. And the other point being, how do we also engage people in active monitoring and adaptation of these policies so that we can continuously innovate and ensure that they're aligned with our major objectives. And so this is an example from like the La Paz, where they had had all of these poverty alleviation sort of strategies for years and years and years. And at some point, the government was like, okay, fine, you know what? You just tell us what kind of projects you want to do, and we will give you some money plus a bit of extra in order to, to ensure that if you want to adapt or align along the way. And it has been so impactful and transformative that has become best practice globally amongst development agencies in terms of new approaches for sort of particularly like urban planning, economic development. But the one thing I'll maybe just mention when we're talking about implementation and participation, right, is that we've been doing this kind of work with piloting with different communities this year, and there is a real participation fatigue. Yeah, so people get annoyed with being asked to tokenly input on like priorities or policies, and then not feeling like it actually ends up having much of a difference, right? Or they're just brought in to sort of validate what had already been planned. And probably one of the best suggestions I heard when we were developing this guide is that you need to promise that anybody you're going to engage in terms of the original visioning or strategy design process that are also going to be engaged in the monitoring and evaluation, right? So they're going to be a part of this whole loop, and they will be a part of actually assessing whether or not this had the impact that they had hoped, right? Or is aligned, because that is a way in which to ensure really meaningful participation throughout. And so then finally we come to the evaluation, and I'm sure we have a lot of evaluation experts here who will know much more than I on these things, but we do have some very exciting innovations around this space as well in terms of assessing well-being and really critically learning from those assessments, right, in order to identify best practice and areas of improvement. And so this is something where, still we have our well-being indicators. There's a lot, increasing numbers of communities and countries that are developing them, but they're still figuring out methods for doing that holistic assessment, right? So really understanding multidimensional well-being across these different areas and their interconnections. So we have a better systems perspective of what impacts what and how different kinds of policies might be important for intervening in those spaces. So it's still early, but Scotland, for example, has been doing some well-being assessments in order to help to inform their sort of economic strategy and long-term planning. And then really critically, I think this is the most important thing. This is a picture, obviously, of New Zealand's well-being budget, which is, one of those leading examples of governments trying to take a different approach to government spending and prioritization. But it's about recognizing that we need experimentation. That it's not like we can say that's a well-being economy yet, and that's how they got there. And so because we don't have that, right, we need to be open to failure, right? To innovating, trying things, seeing if it works, if it doesn't. And I know particularly as policymakers, that's really tough, right? Because there not a lot of grace given for failure. But I think that's also why it's so important to get society engaged, right? Get people engaged so people feel like the policymakers as well and are invested in this, because there is as much to learn from failure as there is success in this. And any sort of innovation is going to be helpful for the larger movement and for accelerating this transition. And so sort of in closing, I just want to sort of summarize the guide and give a couple of proposed next steps for Luxembourg. But at its heart, right, the guide is a collection of tools and resources, suggestions, and case studies. But what it's really aiming to do is to help us to think through how can we develop and internalize new definitions of progress? And then how can we, on that basis, expand our understanding of what the economy is and can be? How do we develop policies really to transform the system? And how do we do all of this in a way that really fosters participatory and context-appropriate policy making that aligns with the unique desires of the community? And critically, how do we continuously learn and adapt on this journey, right? And so that's sort of the aim of the guide in a bit of a nutshell. I hope I've convinced you at least to read it. It's not very long and there's a lot of pictures and things. But I just want to close maybe with a couple of proposals also for specifically for Luxembourg, as I'm getting the sense that, you know, you're already a leader in a lot of this, but, you know, I think there's some additional opportunities for you to really be illustrators of best practice and to push this agenda forward. And so one is considering to potentially join the Wellbeing Economy governments. This is what we call WeGo. And so this is in a partnership of currently Finland, New Zealand, Scotland, Wales, and Iceland, but actually Canada just joined too as well. So we can put a picture of Trudeau up there. And so they have come together as a sort of, you know, an informal partnership of governments that are committed to learning, sharing best practice, and innovating in terms of how to build a well-being economy. And so it's, you know, they have meetings at the like prime minister level, but also amongst their chief economists and different sort of agencies to really think through and figure out this transition. There's also, you know, we've been piloting, as I mentioned, sort of these processes with governments and communities in Scotland, New Zealand, California, and Canada this year. But I think it'd be really amazing to also work with the government in Luxembourg in some way and support with, you know, identifying points of innovation or approaches for continuing like well-being economy policy design here. So as I mentioned, there are a lot of needs for innovation, and I have a sense that you might be a really good place to try to push for that in terms of developing new tools and approaches, practical tools for policymakers in terms of our ability to evaluate which economic activities and behaviors are really contributing most to well-being, around co-creating economic strategies and policies for well-being, and really breaking down silos across government and developing new systems for more like holistic, integrated, and systemic thinking in terms of policy design. And then finally, I guess the major aim of all of it, right, for us to move from a fixation on growth to a fixation on balance, right? And how do we build a balanced economy and society that can be inclusive and sustainable to come? And so then I will just end by saying, I know that not everybody here also is probably working for the government in Luxembourg. So I also want you to know that you can join the Wellbeing Economy Alliance or movement as an individual, as an organization, or as a policymaker also. We have that policymakers network, and I think it'd be great if we could build a hub in maybe Luxembourg for different people if you're interested. So this is where you just come together across stakeholders. So, you know, having civil society, government, business, academia together, really thinking through and advocating for these kind of transformations in place. And so with that, I'll just say thank you. Yeah, this is my email address. This is our website if you want to learn more. But yeah, I'll open it to questions now. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much, Amanda. That's you know, an inspiring set of goals and information. So what we'll do now, though, is open it up for questions. So as mentioned earlier, please write in the chat or raise your virtual hand. So I see Nuno, you raised your hand first. You can unmute yourself and feel free to ask your question.
Hello, everybody. Hello, Kelsey and Francisco. Thank you very much, Amanda, for your presentation. I learned a lot with you. And I have some comments that I would like to make that could contribute to better thinking on this challenge that you raised. The first one is I think that to implement, because the central question is how to implement to have a concrete implementation of a well-being economy. And we need to have a strong theoretical background. Theory, it's fundamental. Neoliberalism has reached its power because Hayek and others and the Chicago School had the ability to implement their agenda. So global elites are, I think, pleased with the way the things are going. And you mentioned the extreme inequalities that we're living. And that indicator is so expressive that I don't know what else that we need to know to change things. The second thing is about power. We need power. Collective actors need power. You of course, you are in your presentation. You are mentioned the importance of participation, the importance of linking together several actors globally. So the concept, the way that we also have to conceptualize power and the importance of some collective actors, because without that collective actors, institutions don't change. We have no change. So we are. I'm talking of governments, political parties, foundations, public institutions, administrative public bodies, companies, and so on. The third point I would like to mention, and you wisely mentioned in your presentations about SDGs. So what will happen on 2013? What will be the purpose of the agenda of United Nations? Does this will serve to anything? We are really improving the lives of people, and these indicators and this agenda is contributing to the well-being economy. And the last commentary, I think it's very important to know what are the best examples that we find in the world, and you have mentioned that. And this fragile alliance needs to get strength, needs to have better strength to, of course, defeat the Mr. Hayek and the global elites and so ever. Thank you very much.
I love it. Yeah, thanks so much, Nuno. I mean, I totally agree with, all of your points. And I think particularly the point around power, that's a really huge thing. And I mean, I can just say from, I come from, an economic sort of background, and I'm definitely nerdy in theory, and I like the new economic ideas and theories. But something which I appreciate about the Wellbeing Economy Alliance is that it really doesn't want to take the sort of top-down elite academic approach to this transformation, or at least, our theory of change is that we do need millions of hearts and minds to come together across expertise areas, like, areas of influence, to really build the power base which is needed for meaningful transformation at the global level, the national level, at the local level. And so that's a lot of what we're trying to do, in different areas. And I hope that you will come and join us, Nuno. Yeah, because I think, we need all hands on deck for that. So thank you so much for those comments. Those are all really, really helpful.
Thank you.
We had two people in the chat who were also talking again about collective institutions. So you need, power is coming back to Nuno's comment. And Sama Abdallah also was again talking about power. And I'll take a moment then as a co-host to ask a question. So I think that part of your response here was that, we get power a little bit with participation. Right, and this is also related to this collective action. And I've been thinking about participation for a while. You mentioned participation fatigue, but I'm also thinking about coordination and getting people to engage initially. So you have low voter participation rates in a lot of countries. So that's one potential challenge. And then there's this whole theory in economics of public choice, right? So to be able to organize, even when you have participants, but participants may not always agree. And then you need maybe smaller groups in order to do this. So participation looks different, in one of the major cities of China, say Beijing or New York, or in some of the communities in which you're working in. So I really love your ideas. And so I'm thinking about how do we scale participation? And then that might also help us address some of these power issues, because you get participation of individuals, but then also participation of businesses too. So there's two parts, I guess.
No, absolutely. And I mean, it's a really, really good question, Kelsey, actually. And I can speak a little bit from the examples, but this is an area as well that a lot of governments are trying to figure out, is like also at which points do you need really widespread participation, and which points do you need more strategic, right? Sort of engagement and groups just to think through and process and develop. And that's not always clear also in this process, at which points you want the broad base and which points you might want a more select group. But I guess one of the things related to your first question, speaking a little bit about that Envision Utah example, was that the way in which they were able to engage the community was what they did was to develop a scenario, like a scenario planning research, which looked at the impacts of if growth just continued unabated, right? Without any sort of intervention, what was going to happen in the next like 20 years. And then also in like a couple other scenarios. And what they then did, and this is where the communication is so important, is they did a massive communication campaign through the local newspapers and the media outlets and these sort of things to raise awareness of this sort of scenario of what was going to happen. And even getting the data they needed was really tough, right? They had to work with a lot of business agencies, with local authorities, with all of these things to develop this model and this research. But that in and of itself was really useful for building, this sort of alignment between, and people got kind of freaked out, right? Like they were like, oh dear, all right, well, this seems concerning. And when they were raising awareness of this issue, they simultaneously then invited people to engage in these discussion and strategy sort of events, right? And they made it as tactile and practical as possible, where people would just put little stickers or dots or colored things for different kind of like economic activities or businesses or whatever, or green areas that they wanted in these different spaces to sort of inform the thinking. And so, yeah, there's different kind of approaches, but I do think the communication is one that we often forget because we can get a little technocratic about it, And so how are we communicating with people about what's happening in a way that makes them feel really engaged from the beginning and wanting to sort of participate? And in terms of the scaling, right, I do think that there are certain technological tools like the DediSem, which can handle large scale amounts of engagement. But also, I think as well, one of the important things to remember is that the government agencies don't always have to do all of this themselves. And sometimes it's actually better that they don't. So you engage community organizations that already have connections, right, with different kinds of stakeholders and groups. Like that's what they did with in Germany, right, is that they engage with different sort of like labor organizations, environmental organizations, gender, blah, 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 to bring together, old folks' homes, blah, 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 to bring together different people. And then the government was actually there just as an observer, right? And that also can sometimes be quite powerful. And then finally, I think the most common approach we're seeing now is around citizens' assemblies, right? And so this is where you're not even trying to engage the whole of the population, but just trying to get like a representative group that can then help to inform sort of like strategy design and stuff. And the citizens' assembly they did in the UK around the environment and climate change policy was amazing. Yeah, they had like got some really radical, cool, visionary, innovative ideas out of this. The issue, of course, being that then the UK hasn't really used it, right, as their starting point for meaningful policy, like coming from it, right? Since then, they had their 10-year strategy and it wasn't really founded on some of these ideas. And so that's, again, where if you're going to engage people in participation, you have to promise that there's going to be something that comes out of it. Otherwise, they will disengage and feel frustrated, right, with participation fatigue. So those are my ideas, but it's again, an important question.
I love that you have examples from our best practices around the world in response to all of these challenges, right? So there's stuff that still needs to be done, but you have an example. I really like the one from Barcelona to address one of my issues or questions. But I'll stop there, and we have some questions. Next one is from Chiara. Is there a risk of misunderstanding participation? And then in parentheses, new initiatives such as forums like Barcelona or Birmingham ones for gathering the necessary support for change through voting, for example. Open petitions, consultations are often a failure in terms of guaranteeing participation and delivering realistic solutions to problems. So yeah, the assemblies, for example, might actually not be representative as an example of, I think, part of what she's saying.
Yeah, I mean, Chiara, I don't know if you would be willing to come off mute. I don't know if I fully understand your question, so I don't know if you want to but maybe, yeah, if I can just make sure that I'm understanding it correctly, right? Is the idea being that, like, if we have, you know, when you have the more open forms of engagement, that it doesn't always lead to sort of like the most effective outcomes, the way that like voting or something does. Is that correct?
Yes. Well, actually, you're talking about, if I understand you correctly, to gather support for change and to have a participative way to find solutions, to propose policies. At the same time, there is a risk because participation, actually a proposition of solutions or a way of changing political agendas can be achieved through different ways. And you have made the example of these forums, city forums like Barcelona, but we have to acknowledge that there is a risk in that. There is a risk of not guaranteeing participation to certain part of the population that are perhaps are actually the most in need or the one that are suffering the most from inequalities, which is also well-being inequalities. And sometimes they deliver solutions that are not realistic because maybe there is no full understanding of problems. And here I think about the Birmingham Forum for Climate Change, in which people have proposed all sorts of different things. But some of them are completely unrealistic or ineffective.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I agree, right, with you. I guess the point is in terms of your first point, this is always the issue with democracy, right? It's like tyranny of the majority. Yeah, like how do you always ensure that the most marginalized voices and their well-being priorities, the things that matter for them, are really taken into consideration? And that is something also that I'm not always clear, and I'm still trying to understand. Like when you go from having all of those different well-being dimensions and things that matter, and then people develop that framework or that vision, what is that on the basis of? Is it just the number of times that people said this thing, right? Is it because, that feels like the most politically expedient one? How do we allow for also there to be national well-being priorities whilst also allowing for diversity across and within communities also, right? And so I think this is an important point around democracy and participation and innovations in that space. But then in terms of the unrealistic solutions, I think I might challenge that a little bit, just because I think we're at a moment in time where like we need the unrealistic solutions. Yeah, like we are at a critical sort of point. And so I don't even think it's so much about, if it's an unrealistic idea, if it's what matters, and then figuring out how to make it happen. But your point being that people won't always have the knowledge in order to ground it is a good point. And that's why in citizens assemblies, at least, like what they normally do is they have expert inputs, right, that come as a way in which to support people to feel like they have the necessary kind of information. Now that always will come with a bias of who's the expert, right, and who's that group and blah blah blah, but at least they try to sort of counterbalance people's intuitive sort of ideas and understandings with grounding and expertise in that sort of process.
Thank you. Just a small point, if I may, for unrealistic solutions, I'm not necessarily thinking about, for realistic solution, I don't necessarily think at easy solutions.
Yeah. Okay.
Thank
Yeah.
you.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you.
I believe Francesco had a question as well.
Yes, thank you, Kelsey, and thank you so much, Amanda. If there's no one else who has a question, I may easily, happily join the conversation. I don't know how many among the participants had the opportunity to read the guide that Amanda presented. I actually did, so I'm quite familiar with the contents that she presented. And I would like actually to ask you to, tap a little bit on your knowledge of these many experiences from all over the world. And there was one, the experiment of Utah, that actually attracted my attention. I'd like to know if you can tell us a little bit more about that, because you said that at some point in 1990s, the community realized that the development process they were taking up was leading them on a path of destroying natural social resources. And so they started a conversation to steer direction in different, and this is fantastic, speaks a ton about rationality, which I very often criticize. But then you also said that at the beginning, this process found a lot of resistance. And I wonder, how did they manage to overcome this initial resistance? Because more and more politicians, especially in the Western world, are facing the challenge that they have to work in the short term. To take their vision lasts at best 6 months. And their main problem is how they win elections next term. So how did these guys manage to overcome this challenge and actually serve the public good rather than their electoral turnout?
Mm-hmm. So, I mean, I will do my best, right, to tell you a bit about what I have understood from reading about the sort of process. But my understanding, and I will say this actually as maybe a really important point, is that I think often citizens feel like policymakers are the ones with all the power. But policymakers are some of the least empowered people in the world, right? They don't feel like they have any power. And so you're sort of like stuck at this little bit of a cycle here. But in my experience thus far, and particularly in the research and working with organizations, single individuals within government are the major things that change the world. Yeah, like in terms of like a single individual who's passionate about this kind of thing is what leads to these kind of innovations, right? And ideally what happens is they normally find a couple of allies within government, right, who also believe in this, who are willing to like stand and push for these kind of shifts. And so I think in Utah, I don't know what that aha moment was, of being like, oh, wow, we're growing way too fast. But they were growing really, really, their economic growth rate was really huge. And a lot of people were moving into the state. All of these businesses were happening. And there was something that tipped off, I guess, a couple of people in the economic planning department that this needs to be managed in some way, which is very like non-neoliberal, right? A pretty like radical kind of thinking at the time. But what they did was, so they brought together, they created a little coalition, right? That was called the Envision Utah sort of team. And they wanted, and I also am not clear exactly why they were so clear also that they wanted to achieve this in a participatory and really inclusive way, that they wanted to develop a new sort of inclusive growth strategy in that form. But I think part of the strategies that they used in trying to do this was, I think I mentioned like a few of them, was that one, in order to overcome the paternalistic objections, right, which was by, people who were like, you can't be engaging people in this sort of process. Like people don't know what they want. They don't know what's good for them. Like they're not going to be able to make any sense of our economy, blah, 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 was to frame it as visioning. Yeah. So that was one strategic point. When you talk about something like a vision, everybody has like some sort of role to play in a vision as opposed to a plan or a project or a strategy, right? Which can feel more like technocratic. And then the other thing was to talk about it as like, and that vision also was a way in which to get the different agencies. So there was a lot of resistance from municipal level governments that felt like this state level initiative was going to encroach on their sort of like power and influence. And so the visioning and also the process stuff was a way for them to really engage in that as well. And yeah, for them to then also not be bound by a short time frame, because I think it took like maybe 3-4 years for them to go through just getting everybody on board, for getting all of the different data that they sort of needed, and to allow yourself that time, because also with the pilots we're doing right now, most of this is about trust building, actually. Yeah. And that takes time. It's about relationships with people, and you can't really rush it. And so allowing for that time to make those connections and for that to sort of ripple out, I think, is something which is often underestimated with these kind of initiatives. And then what was I going to say? Yeah, in the end, I think what's interesting about the Envision Utah, I guess, case was that the strategy design process itself ended up being sustainable over a long term, but also that voters like perceptions actually changed. So they had like initially in like the 90s proposed a bill for this public transportation network that was going to connect these various like counties in the state, and they got it almost like everybody voted against it because it's a pretty conservative state economically and socially, and they don't always like the government. But then by the time that the Envision Utah project had ended, they got an almost unanimous vote for it because people understood why, yeah, it mattered and related to the things they cared about, right? And so that's also another point. I think when, you were talking around like the need for, that's why like engaging people in these processes and building that power is so important. Because one of the, I don't know if you know Lorenzo Fiamonte. So he's been a big thinker in well-being, like the Wellbeing Economy movement, and he worked as a minister in Italy and was really trying to push for this well-being economy stuff within the government. And as a minister, right? But he didn't have the social foundations and support, yeah, and ended up getting pretty brutally like attacked and destroyed by the businesses, right? By different sort of other agencies, by all of these things. And so this is why you need it to happen at both levels. You need like the political will and vision, but you also need this like citizen support for it. And yeah, it's a bit of a chicken and egg yeah, sort of thing. But hopefully you can do both simultaneously.
So if we may ask you one last question.
Sure.
We've run a little bit over time, maybe a lot over time. Thank you everyone for staying, and you also, Amanda. Last question is from Sama Abdallah. Sama, if you want to unmute yourself, feel free to go for it.
Yeah, thank you very much, and nice to. I think we've only met once, Amanda, but I think I was working with Michael and Rabia on the Climate Index. Yeah. So my question is, and I had various questions, but other people always ask them. But there's one that that's kind of stuck with me. So the way you've described this process and the way it's sort of as you've mentioned yourself, like participation is kind of a key part of this, and I feel like most of the conversation has been about that. For me, it's quite funny because before I started working on well-being, I studied like deliberative democracy, so it's kind of it's linked in my mind as well. But do you almost feel like actually a well-being economy approach is a participatory approach? I mean, are they almost synonymous in a way? And to the extent that they are closely related, in terms of the sort of the political battle, in terms of sort of like getting this to be taken seriously and to be taken up by the public and politicians, which narrative do you think is most effective? I mean, should we all be changing its name to like the participatory approach or something like that? I mean, in your experience, do you feel that well-being as a concept, the well-being economy as a concept, gets more support, or the participation one? And I'm just wondering how we link the two. And Because obviously there's a very strong sort of world out there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I guess in terms of are they synonymous? I think more so when I started off and I was talking about those principles, right? So the sort of principles that underpin participation is a really important one, right? But I wouldn't necessarily say it's like the only important one, right? Because you also have these other principles around what is the goal, right? Like what is the sort of view of the sort of systemic, like systems thinking, holistic approach, that more strength-based, as opposed to just viewing like the government as a market corrector, right? You really view them as an active molder and director of our economic system. And I think there are quite a few other principles, and this is all around process also. And so this is as well important to differentiate this policy design guide from the Wellbeing Economy movement and broader conception as well, because there are, you know, to Nuno's point as well, like a lot of very important like academic and like thinkers that are working in this space around different sort of theories and approaches and understandings of the economy. We have, you know, different like civil society and like organizations and things. But I do think participation is critical because I guess our economic failures and our governmental failures are interconnected. Yeah. So, and that you can't necessarily separate the two, and people themselves, right? Like they are really disillusioned with government, right? They are very disillusioned with our system as it is. And so in order to build a different economic system, you need a different type of political system. Yeah, I guess is the point, right? And so they are interconnected, but whether or not they are one and the same, like I wouldn't necessarily say so, but I do think it's a really important principle for this kind of process. Now, I think I see Elena from the OECD, but I was speaking with somebody who works at the OECD's, they don't call it like deliberative democracy or participate. They have a certain department, and I don't remember exactly what the name of it is. But she was speaking about how they've been doing all this research on, you know, past 50 years of different sort of participatory deliberative democracy approaches. And there were a lot of different experimentations. And she was saying the last like 2-3 years, it's been like exponential. Yeah, like it's been crazy all around like the OECD countries. There's so much experimentation. And so I do think that this is an area where when you're listening, I guess, like to the membership and things, it was one of those points where I was like, okay, this is coming up over and over and over again, right? Like it's a really important point. And that's where it's sort of, you know, it's again, where energy is and where you're seeing points of transformation. But it was a bit of a rambly response to you. So, yeah, but I don't know if that's helpful.
That's very interesting. Thank you very much.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Amanda. So yes, we have really gone over time. Again, I appreciate that you're willing to hang out with us to answer all of these questions. And thank you, all of the participants, for joining in today. With that, I think we'll close. So thank you again. Have a great day.
Thank you so much.
Thanks,
Thank you.
everyone.
Thanks, everybody.
It was great to see you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thanks.
Bye. Bye. Bye,
Bye-bye.
everyone.
Take care.
Bye.